welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're talking about something that has been really in the back of my mind for a couple weeks now, and I'm really excited that now I'll talk about it here. I also wrote a blog post on this topic, so I'll put that in the description as well. So I don't talk about this a ton on my YouTube channel, but I have a podcast with my two best friends, Laura and McKenna, and it's called Fuck Wellness. And we unpack the wellness industry and try to redefine wellness to fit our needs and desires. So every month we have a different theme, and in January our theme was discipline. And that was a huge month for me in unpacking and unlearning all of these preconceived notions I had about what discipline means, who is lazy, who's not lazy. Obviously I talked about that in a different video, but really unpacking all the decades of my life that I've called myself disciplined without really realizing where that came from. So one of our episodes of Fuck Wellness, we looked at the grit scale. And so today I'm gonna talk a little bit about the book Grit by Angela Duckworth, because we actually had not read the book before that episode, and we had so many people reach out to us after that episode being like, you have to read Grit. Oh my gosh, we love Angela Duckworth's work on grit. So, you know, I'm a good reader, so I got the book from my library and I started to read it. So today's episode is going to be my take on Angela Duckworth's research and book Grit, why I kind of disagree with some fundamental assumptions she makes in her book, and where I think we can move forward using the mindset of grit, but without using, you know, values-based assumptions when we think about grit in our society. So we're gonna hop right in today. So Angela Duckworth starts off her book by giving this example that we also talked about in our podcast. So she has a grit scale, and I don't remember exactly how many questions are on the grit scale, but it's a survey, it's a validated, reliable survey, and she gives it to people and essentially can predict whether or not people will succeed in a given task. So the first example she gives in the book is West Point, the military academy West Point. And she says that she can predict in the first year of West Point who will make it through that first year and who will drop out based on her grit scale. The underlying assumption of that being that the people who are grittier will stick through that first year and those who drop out are less gritty. And I started off with that example and it bothered me. I was like, think about those people who dropped out. It doesn't mean that they're less gritty. It just means that that environment may not have aligned with their interests, may have not been something they wanted to pursue long term. They may now be pursuing something that is equally challenging. They may show their grit in a different way, but that doesn't mean they're not going to be successful in their lives. And I think that example that she gives is really emblematic of the underlying assumption in grit, that grit is a sign of success. The grittier you are, the more successful you'll be in your life. So throughout the book, she looks at CEOs and Olympic athletes and chefs and artists. And I think that it's important to start off this conversation by thinking about how we're defining success in our society. Because arguably, someone who is a dishwasher for a restaurant and has 3 other jobs is very gritty, but he wouldn't get interviewed by Angela Duckworth, but yet he might actually be grittier than an Olympic athlete. We don't know that. And so I think the original assumption that she makes in her book that grit is really what will lead to success is where the problem started for me. I also just think, as someone who studies and looks at behavior change and works with lots of clients, I think it's important to recognize that grit, and Angela Duckworth defines grit as a mix of passion and perseverance, that grit is largely situational and environmental. So those people who thrived in West Point, great, that displayed their grit, but someone else might make it on the Olympic sailing team after they dropped out of West Point, and that is also a situation in which they could display grit. We display grit every single day, and I just think by essentially believing that showing grit in one situation means that you will always be gritty is problematic, or in a situation not showing grit, that means that you're automatically not going to be successful in life. That seems very problematic to me. going along with that, the grit scale is a cross-sectional survey. It's looking at a singular point in time. It tells you nothing about that person's grit before the survey or after the survey. It's just looking at that one point in time. And I think that's important to look at here because we've all had moments of grit. Everyone has. No one has never had a grit moment. And we may have many of those and we may not, but that's not a sign of our value as a person or our success. So I think in essentially saying that this one survey is able to predict our grittiness over time is not accurate and also is not representative of who we are as people existing in the world. So the first half of the book was Angela Duckworth sort of unpacking why she believes grit is a good measure and different situations in which she was able to validate her survey. The second half of the book looks a bit at how you can grow grit over time and where you can kind of dig in and build that grit. And actually, I enjoyed the second half of the book a lot more than the first half. But I would say like one of the main problems I had with the second half is under interests, and that was one of the ways she said we could get better at grit, is that the grittiest people have high level goals that they're constantly looking to meet. So if you think about a high level goal here, you're always striving for that, and under that you have your mid-level goals and then your low-level goals. And she was saying that the grittiest people, all of those goals align on this high-level goal. So I'm not sure I've talked about this a lot on my YouTube channel, but I don't think I have a high-level goal. And I may have one someday, and most of my friends don't have a high-level goal. And I was just really reflecting on like, does that mean I'm not gritty? Does that mean I'm not going to be successful? And I was especially thinking about millennials and how we're going to switch, according to the research, switch jobs 6 or 7 times. And how does grit fall into that? Because at one point, Angela Duckworth gives the example of this student at a university comes up to her after a lecture and says, I just worked so hard on this startup. I'm really excited about it. Like, I showed a lot of grit through this process. And Angela Duckworth says, all right, call me back in 10 years. And if you're working on the same project, that shows grit, not just this short-term push. And her point being that sticking with something, perseverance, sticking with something over a long period of time is a measure of grit. And I was just thinking, what if that guy switches jobs 4 times? Is he just not gritty because of that? It just seems like a really, really bad measure given that we're not supposed to be in the same job for our whole life. Some people that works really well for them. Most people that doesn't work well for them. And that doesn't mean that they're not gritty as people. That doesn't mean that they're not valuable as human beings. So it seemed like a bad assumption to start off the second half of the book with. I also want to tie in our conversation from a couple weeks ago about intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. So what if grit is entirely motivated by extrinsic factors? Is it still a sign of success? Or what if you're mostly motivated by intrinsic factors? I think about all the times that I feel like by her definition I've shown grit. It was all times that I pushed past my intuition and my body cues, and I ended up regretting it long term because it meant that I was being motivated by something outside of my control or outside of something that I wanted to do. So I wonder sometimes, and this goes back to a bit of the discipline conversation, at what point is grit getting in the way of us finding our passions and living long, happy, successful lives? And I want to tie this too to the concept of capitalism a bit, and I feel like grit really, really falls into this like myth of productivity, that we're constantly having to have output that meets society's needs, that efficiency is key, and grit is saying that. Grit is saying that if you find a passion and you persevere through it, that is success. But I don't think that's always the best measure. And so that kind of leads me to my last thought, that what's the utility of defining grit? What is the utility of knowing whether or not you're gritty? Because in some situations, you're going to display grit. In other situations, you may not. And that both of those situations are fine, and they both situations may serve you in the long run. And I think like putting value on one instead of the other is so problematic, especially just thinking about young people who are really trying out different things, and to say pushing past your boundaries and pushing your comfort zone always is the way you demonstrate grit. And she gives the example of the National Spelling Bee and how she can predict the winner of the National Spelling Bee based on their grit. Okay, that's great, but maybe that person's not a well-rounded person. Maybe they're spelling 23 hours a day and they have no social life, and maybe that doesn't mean that they're going to be successful in the long term. So I just feel like, at what point is grit not helping us? And I think with even me, the concept of grit hasn't helped me decide like who I am as a person, because there's gonna be some situations I'm motivated by some things and other situations I'm motivated by other things, and that's okay. That's life. But to then put value on one over the other, that's where she loses me. I just wanna end here by saying grit is not a bad thing to have, but I think it comes with a grain of salt. And I like to say it like this: grit is not the goal. It can be in some situations. I think about when Ryan and my mom, when we went backpacking, you do have to show a certain level of grit to go backpacking. And that's situational. But me persevering through that backpacking trip didn't make me a better person than someone who had to hike out on the first day. That just meant that I was able to grit my teeth and get through, and that doesn't give me any more value as a person. So as I said at the beginning, I wrote a blog post about this, which I think goes into more detail about some of the nuance in her research. I'll put that in the description. And I will also link our discipline episodes of Fuck Wellness from January. I think those also give a good layer of looking at society and how we define positive motivators and bad motivators, and how that really impacts how we view ourselves. So thank you so much for watching today. Actually, one last thought here too. I don't think Angela Duckworth is a bad person at all. Like, I don't want this to come off as if I don't respect her as a researcher, but I do think that when we get into these conversations about what is successful and what's not, we end up harming people more than we're helping them. So I would say read the book, have your own take. I want everyone to view my videos as you can watch them and make your own opinion about them. I'm just one person with one life experience, and I think it's important for everyone to have your own take on things. Take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, because you may have a different life experience that has led you to a different place. And I hope you apply this to all my videos, because I think having a critical lens on all of these topics is important. So anyway, with that, I'm actually done now. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. Like, comment if you have a lot of thoughts on this. I appreciate you all. Thank you.